It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, the good news for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller scorecard is that both you and Al made it clear last week that the Virginia governor's race would be extremely close. The bad news, and much to the surprise of many, Terry McAuliffe did not win against Glenn Younkin, which turned out to be quite an upset. Beyond the risk of political predictions, there seems to be a lot of takeaways for both parties coming out of this race. Could you start us out by sharing what yours were?
You know, I'm sure Al feels the same way. We might have gotten the prediction wrong, but the reasons for the closeness of the race, I think we've had right for some time. And by that, I mean that people are concerned, they're troubled, they want candidates that speak to them in a way that makes them as voters believe the candidate cares about the issues they care about. And the Younkin campaign did that. Remarkably, you know, I first timer looked at the situation and realized that if he really focused on the top issues that Virginians were worried about and didn't pay too much attention to the Trump war cries by Terry McAuliffe, that he'd do better. And I think he navigated that about as well as he possibly could. Terry McAuliffe, who is a very skilled politician, is got to be asking himself today whether the strategy was wrong. It seems to have not worked for him. And there were some unforced errors. The comment about people shouldn't be telling schools what to teach their kids, that resonated throughout the state, and he never really kind of fought back on that. I'm sure he didn't mean to say it exactly the way he said it, and I know he says it's taken out of context, but hey, he's a political pro. If you say it, if those words are on tape, they're going to be used against you. So I thought, Younkin again capitalized on that. I read in my, from my Republican friends and hear from them that, boy, this is a roadmap now. And I'm not sure that's right either. I think this was a different kind of race. There wasn't the sort of primary that many Republicans face across the country. Younkin had the ability to finance his campaign more than many have. So it's not necessarily the case that Trump has been eliminated from the equation. I do think the Trump mystique, whatever you want to call it around elections, has been lessened by this, because I think the facts, at least in Virginia, show that voters are concerned about a whole set of issues, and that looking in the rearview mirror about who the past president was, it doesn't have as much salience as some might think. I know, frankly, I'm encouraged. I look at the Republican ticket, not just Younkin, but across the board. Woman, first African American as lieutenant governor, attorney general in the state. That really represents a look that a lot of people didn't think the Republican Party could put forward, and it has. If Younkin is able to deliver on the long list of promises that he rattled off on election night, or even half of them, he will be quite formidable, I think, on the national scene, because the earth did move a little bit on Tuesday night. Have we changed the way elections are going to be fought across the land? Probably not entirely, but there has been a shift, and there needed, in my view, there needed to be one where you could show that there's an alternative to simply finding the most conservative Republican candidate to put up against Democrats. You may want to talk about it further. I would say also where the real calculations have to occur is in Washington, D.C. now, and the extent to which Democrats who want to hold things up or negotiate for weeks on end are really going to be tolerated, because I think part of this campaign was a message that said, look, we the voters We may be impatient, but we want results that matter to us. And I think the Biden administration, having been given majorities in the House and the Senate, has a real obligation to move forward on some of these initiatives, or it will clearly be a problem in the 2022 elections.
Al, is that your take?
Well, I always try not to take too much from a single election, especially one like this, in the sense it followed historical tides. The incumbent president usually doesn't do well in the year after, especially when his numbers are very low, and Biden's are. But to me, this one seemed a little different because I think it offered a number of lessons. I thought as those returns were coming in from across the country on Tuesday night, I felt like I was back in the 1980s. That, the first line of my book was on election night in 1980, I had a party and nobody came. And the reason nobody came is because all of my friends who had been invited had lost their jobs in the Craig Fuller Reagan landslide. We ended the 1980s by starting the DLC. And in 1989, Craig may remember this, we did an analysis called Democrats in the Presidency. We called it Politics of Evasion, because Democrats have a hard time facing hard truths. The hard truth of this one is if you look across the country, and I think you can go from Virginia to Seattle and up to New York and on Long Island and basically across the country, the voters that gave Biden the presidency and gave the Democrats the House in 2018 started to move back to the Republicans. They're the swing voters, college educated in the suburbs. It didn't mean that Republican candidates necessarily swept the suburbs, even though they won in some, but they did cut their enormous losses that Trump had helped them, or that Trump was in large part responsible for, and even women voters. Now, those voters are not liberals. They tend to be moderate. And what the Democrats, and they're certainly not wedded to one party, Democrats learned that they rented them and they didn't own them. So what are some of the lessons? I think we learned that, sort of Trumpism and progressives have a lot in common. They're the loudest, most passionate parts of their party, so they can win primaries, no question about it. But they're both a very small part of the general election. Progressives in Virginia were 23%, and nationally they're 23, 24, 25%, depending on if they have a good year or not. So they have a hard time winning in contested general elections. And both Trumpism and Trump and the progressives have a similar impact on swing voters. They drive them to the other party. Essentially what progressives do for Democrats is they remind them why they often vote Republican. And that is not a good thing. So for the Democrats, I think the big mistake they've made, and they continue to make it, I've sort of groused about this a little bit, but because of party loyalty, I try to keep it down, is Biden and the congressional leaders let the progressives, the far left of our party, define our party. As I said, that reminds Republicans of why they often vote Republican and certainly swing voters. The fact that progressives defining the party is bad for Democrats should be obvious by now. Everyone, because voters keep telling them every year in and year out. All of the seats that flipped in 2018 from Republican to Democrat were won by moderates. The primaries, Democratic voters had a choice, and they rejected Bernie Sanders and his gazillion-dollar programs. And that was Biden's argument against him. It costs too much. Then we saw in the House races that a lot of that Trump feeling didn't necessarily carry down to the House races, and the Republicans started to come back. They won 12 of those moderate seats back. This year, we saw it in the primary in New York, in Ohio 11, and as I said, only 23% of the Virginia voters were liberal, and 51% of the voters in Virginia said the Democratic Party was too liberal. I think Younkin won 95% of that. That was almost his whole vote. I mean, if he had had that as his base, he probably would have won no matter what he did. Progressive arguments that are for socialism and big government and things like defund the police just don't sell. It's not that they can't win in Blue Havens. They won the mayorship in Boston and they're crowing about that. They won the mayorship in Pittsburgh. But you know what, the last time there was a Republican governor or a Republican mayor in Boston, it was in 1930. He got elected in 1928, before the Depression, before FDR. And the last time there was a Republican mayor of Pittsburgh was in 1933. But on Tuesday, that message was clear. It was clear in Virginia. It was clear in New Jersey. It was clear in Buffalo, New York, where they won a primary. They had a Democratic Socialist that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and AOC trumped in to support as the future of the Democratic Party. And she lost overwhelmingly to a write-in candidate. She was the only one on the ballot and she couldn't win. And then in Minneapolis, which is a pretty liberal city politically, they had a referendum to defund the police, and that lost 6-4. And not only that, the mayor, who all the activists who've been attacking, they have this, this crazy rating system of voting, but won the first round overwhelmingly. For Biden, all this is particularly harmful to me because what it does is undermines his main promise, which wasn't to give you $1 trillion in programs. It was to bring the country together, make it work, because he was the guy. The other thing I'd say is that Democrats really misread the concerns of the voters on inflation. I mean, I sat in the Carter White House and watched gas prices kill us, and that was a big problem in Virginia. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the Gallup poll saying the people wanting small government is back, which has been the case 29 of the last 27, or 27 of the last 29 years. The only two times it hasn't has been after 9/11 and in the midst of the pandemic. These swing voters don't like big government and taxes. Clearly, the Democrats the Democrats misread the crime issue. And even on the race issue, there's a moralistic tone to the progressives that makes a lot of these moderates in the suburbs, who should be our allies in expanding voting rights, it tries to hang guilt on them for not being pure enough. I think that's a big problem. I just want to say one other thing. I think strategically, and I've really been thinking about this, not passing the infrastructure bill was an enormous, colossal strategic blunder. And not because it was going to put projects and people to work by election day. It was a strategic blunder because it did two things. One, it undermined the Biden promise that it was going to work together because he got 19 Republicans. And then he said, we're not going to do that until we get the Democratic bill too. And so it discourages Republicans, I think, and I certainly don't have any, the Republicans have been wrong to oppose everything, but why do you work with somebody if he makes a deal with you and then immediately ignores it? I think in that, and the people understand that. And the second thing, he makes it look weak because basically he says, I make this deal, it carries out my biggest promise of my campaign. And what happens? These progressives who I beat 2-1 in the primaries say, you can't go ahead with that deal. And Craig will agree that there's nothing that hurts a president more than looking weak. So I would have passed that. And then I would have brought these other things up individually. and built constituents for them. Probably would have got Republicans in some of them, maybe not. Now, the most hopeful thing I see is as we were starting to tape this morning, I saw something go across saying that Biden has imposed a rule that's going to require individual companies to mandate vaccines by January 4th. I know that isn't an overwhelming position, but it's a position of strength, and getting the pandemic out of the way, if he can, through vaccines, is going to be the best thing that could happen for him and the party going forward.
Greg, you have the last word today. I guess, what do you say to, if you're in the Oval Office and you're giving some advice to Joe Biden at this point, what is the road forward? You know, it's amazing how few people know what's in the Build Back Better proposal. There's a feeling like the Democrats want to spend money that they don't have. And yet, you know, as Al was saying, there's a lot at stake in getting these things passed. What's the road forward?
You know, I've always thought voters vote for an elected official whom they believe cares about issues that affect them. And so you've got to make these things relevant. You can't be talking about Build Back Better and trillions of dollars and should it be 3 or 1.7. That they don't relate to that. I would emphasize one of Al's points by a set of numbers that I think Biden should pay close attention to for governing, which is that he won in Virginia. He won independent voters by 19 percentage points, I think 18 percentage points. Younkin won independent voters by 8 percentage points, a 28-point change. And so both parties have loud voices, angry people at each extreme, but they are not the ones who determine elections. And to play to either end of the spectrum is not going to work from a governing standpoint. So they've got to do. I heard James Carville, who, boy, he unleashed the tirade on the Democrats. But one of his points was you've got to do a better job marketing. You know, there've been some successes, and Al said that, but people don't know it because it's this Washington talk, and that is not working across the land in 2021, and I do not believe it'll work in 2022.
That's all the time we have for this morning. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you very much indeed. We will see you next week.